back there. So, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to this 4-part series through the month of September. We'll be doing called "What Does the Bible Say About That?" And the purpose of this is a couple of things. One, to really address not what does your pastor think about this, but what does the Bible actually say about this, and to do some real investigation in the words used and the context and that sort of thing about what is going on from a biblical perspective, considering that we were all raised in an atmosphere, even if you were raised Catholic, raised in an atmosphere in which the authority of Scripture has increased greatly. So the first question is almost always, well, what does the Bible say about that? And so then we go and look. Now, we'll discover with some of these topics that the Bible, what does the Bible say about that is a more difficult question to answer. But we will do that by having our Bibles in our hand and going and looking at some of the common passages that are used and trying to address those. That's what we'll do throughout this time. And our first controversial topic is abortion. And this should be a really, really short class because the answer to what does the Bible say about abortion is nothing. Right? At least not abortion the way that we think about it. This is part of our problem as we go through and look at these various topics, is what does that word or that topic mean in our context? Does it mean the same thing? So we could do a week on what does the Bible say about marriage, and its marriages won't look anything like any of ours. They're just, it's a totally different context. And the idea about what marriage was behind, the idea that we have all in our heads that you might meet someone who you fall in love with and you get married to them because you love them is a very, very modern concept. Even in our culture, if you went back to even in the 1800s, that was not what you married for. You might love the person. That might be a nice thing. You might fall in love with them eventually. That could be a bonus. And in other cultures, it's not even on the table. Certainly in the culture of the New Testament. But that's a whole nother class on marriage. So we're going to set that aside. So what does we know what the common arguments are right now, and we know what a big issue this has become. So before we get to what the Bible actually talks about here, I want us to talk about just this issue and the history of this issue within our culture and certainly within our political framework. So if you go back to the 70s, you have, this will be a story told in broad brushstrokes. You have the rise of the so-called religious right. You have focus on the family begins in the 80s, but prior to that you have Falwell and you have the moral majority. You have all of those things kind of rising up. And that in the early 80s becomes combined in the Reagan Revolution, and Ronald Reagan does this actually it wasn't Reagan, it was his advisors who did this masterful approach of combining conservative Republicans with conservative evangelicals who prior to that point tended to stay out of politics and merging them together, but they needed a focal point issue. And the history tells us that they had one, but that focal point issue was segregation. And they couldn't sell that. What they could sell was this notion and an anti-abortion stance that said, we're trying to protect children. Now, we had to have this notion of when is a child a child? And if I were to ask around this room, we would have 72 different answers. And a lot of people saying, I'm not really sure. Is it at, now, if we go to the Bible will tell us it's the first breath, is when, that's what in ancient Hebrew thinking, that's when life came to be. Prior to that, it was somewhere in between life. It wasn't a human being. A fetus was not a human being, but it was on its way. And if you were to go to culture, you would have a whole bunch of different answers to that question as well, including in the medical community, where you have, because there's no definitive way. That is a subjective question. What do you think it means? But it wasn't a subjective question for this political movement, which, as you've seen, has pushed even to these later days into saying the moment of conception, right? That is life. And even, have you noticed, more than that, like those eggs that are frozen are life, right? Yeah, and then you have a personhood argument, right? So we move into these various levels, which is a natural logical progression if you're going to make this the argument that they began with. So we keep in mind a couple of things. One, the argument was designed to gain political power for an issue that hadn't been their issue up until that point. In fact, the Southern Baptist Convention, as late as the early 70s, had a stance that was pro-choice. And that turned on a dime when they decided, this is the agenda we're going to take. And in the pursuit of power, they were using this as a wedge issue. Okay? So, obviously the big court cases around that, Roe v. Wade, which extended the right of choice. That went on for several decades. And then, of course, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health is the case in which Roe v. Wade was overturned effectively. That's a more complicated legal argument than that, but that's essentially the gist of that. And we have now very clear sides. So one side is pro-birth. Yeah, that's not what it says. And one side is, yeah, and that's what we think this is. And what's interesting is notice even in the titles of these sides, these are arguing different things. These are not the same argument. Now, we could have an argument about what constitutes life. When does life come to be? How do we define that? Does it go on past birth? Does sanctity of life extend to other things? You can say what you want to say about the Catholics, but at least they're logically consistent because they argue aggressively for, in their policies, their official policies, the death penalty is just as immoral as abortion is because of this. Right? So you could argue all that. That's around that, but this is a different question. If we're going to allow that there's ambiguity in this answer, that we have this room full of people and we'll have 72 different answers, then doesn't it make moral sense that there has to be some level of choice, that somebody has to be able to make their own discernment about that at some point? Okay. Now, obviously, I am biased in that opinion. So we're going to go look at what the Bible actually says about this. And the Bible centers basically on this one word because it doesn't say hardly anything. You'll see when we get to the verses that there are abstractions about the notion of life. There's no simple, you shall not have an abortion. It does not say that anywhere in the Bible. Okay? It does use this word a couple of times, nephel. We don't really know what it means. It may mean something that has fallen. It may mean an untimely birth. This may mean something more what we would think of as miscarriage as opposed to what we classify. Again, we have a totally different set of medical terms for what we're talking about here. Okay? So that's the word that shows up in the Hebrew texts. There's very little in the New Testament, but we'll get to those. So now's the time for you to pull out your Bibles. And we're going to look up some different texts and see what it says.
That's my favorite song.
Psalm 139. You can find Psalm 139. And once you find it, it's a long psalm. I want somebody to find it, read through, and think what verse you would pull out of there to be a commentary on abortion. And when you find it, just let me know. Just say it out loud.
You knit me together in my mother's womb.
Anybody find that? You found, you knit me together in my mother's womb. You'll probably have some different translations depending on what version of the Bible you're looking at, but it's going to be something close to that. Do you all see that?
13.
It's 13? Mm-hmm. Okay, so you can understand how a line. Somebody read the whole line.
You are the one who
There you go.
Well, mine's a CB, but okay.
That's okay.
You are the one who created my innermost parts. You knit me together while I was still in my mother's womb.
Right. You gonna? Yeah. Okay. Here. Everybody probably has something pretty close to that.
King James.
Oh, King James. Oh. Well, let's bring King James for crying out loud. Yes.
Here we go. Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. So you see how you could pull verse 13 out and make a connection. Does that seem logical to everybody? Now I encourage you to read, so this is what we'll do with all of our verses. We will read the verse that we think highlights. Sometimes I'll give it to you, and sometimes we'll just talk about it and see if you can pick it out. Then I want you to read the context. First, the context is what are the lines around that line? Beware, I warn you, of single line quoters. Right? Beware, because you always need to know what that means in context. And it's quite often that you find a line quoted out of context and you put it in, you go and read it in the passage and you're like, well, that's not what that says at all. Right? So, read all of 139. Does anybody have any commentary they would like to give us on how this is now problematic? Yeah.
If you jump up to verse 7,
Mm-hmm.
it starts, where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? So
Right.
it sounds like you cannot escape the presence of spirit,
Right.
even while you were there,
Yep.
and that changes.
Yep. It's not a commentary at all about sanctity of life, or what we would call, or when does life begin. It's a commentary about the presence of God always with us, right?
Okay, back to King James. The first part of that whole verse says, "For thou hast possessed my reins."
Possessed my reins?
My reins. For thou hast
Is that
possessed
like
my reins.
like reins?
Like you're
or like
you're
reins?
controlling my life.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Anyone else? See anything? Gina sees something from way in the back, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I just, I love this psalm. It starts out so nice. It's really my favorite. But then all of a sudden he like switches gears. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, oh God.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound very pro-life to me.
Yeah. Well, see, isn't that interesting? Pro-life, when we ask this question of pro-life, we could also ask pro-whose life? How do we judge a pro-life world in which we know that the maternal health outcomes for particular people, depending on the color of skin, are dramatically different? Right.
Chris,
Yeah.
I like verse 16.
Verse 16.
Yeah, your eyes saw my embryo, and on your scroll every day was written that was being formed for me before any one of them had yet happened.
What version are you reading?
The Common English.
Really? Interesting.
God, your plans are incomprehensible to me. Their
Yeah.
total number is countless, meaning it could be written on the scrolls that you were not to have sustained life.
Could be. Your ways are, yeah, right.
They've already been written.
It's interesting that it says embryo. Does anybody else have in their version
Yeah.
embryo? In 16. Unformed. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that it's saying that, like, your destiny has already been decided. It's been written, and the Spirit is with you no matter what, from
So
the
now-
dust to
Exactly.
the end.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if
So
you...
it's commentary on something, it's like a theological commentary, not a scientific commentary on, right? I want us to note that it is interesting, the Common English Bible, which I like that translation by and large. The Common English Bible is one of the more recent translations, and it does come from part of the group are evangelical translators, scholars. It is interesting that unformed substance becomes a word that is very much in our vernacular, that is not an ancient word. It is a word from our time. It is a word from microscope time. Embryo, right? So think for a moment about the decision making in translating whatever was translated, and that goes on all the time. I am not saying to you there's a nefarious purpose to that. I'm saying to you that the choices that people make reflect that we all have bias. And we have bias when we translate, and we have bias when we read. And that's not a bad thing, it's just a thing. So just be aware that it's a thing. It sure can be a bad thing, depending on how much somebody leans into that. The thing that makes it a bad thing is when we make that absolute. Not, oh, I've translated it this way, but this is the only way to translate this because it's the right way, because it isn't me translating, it's God translating through me. Now we're talking about something different. Okay? All right. Yeah. We should argue over these meanings, right? We should argue over this stuff. What does it really mean? Now let's look at Jeremiah 1:5. Jeremiah comes after the Psalms. Keep going past Isaiah. If you've got a phone, you can just type it in. Jeremiah 1:5. Now this is a particular verse. Anybody want to read that? Tracy will read it. Common English Bible.
Before I created you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I made you a prophet to the nations.
Right. Okay? So here's the first and obvious thing. We have to deal with pronouns. Who is you? Am I part of that you? Who is God speaking to? Jeremiah. This is not necessarily a universal edict for all human beings. This is God saying, Jeremiah, before you were born, I set you out. But this is one of the primary texts used around that sanctity of life, pro-life position. That what is true for Jeremiah is true for all of us. Jeremiah, by the way, is killed by the authorities. So do we want to carry that all the way through in terms of what is good for Jeremiah is good for all of us? Or do we just want the first part and not the rest of it?
What they use is, so Jeremiah is a person, essentially, before birth.
Right.
So that's where they
So
get the basis.
is this a universal edict saying that all people, all human beings, God knows in this way and calls them out in this way and treasures them in this way, which is honestly a lovely sentiment. It's a nice thing to think. Or is this a comment on Jeremiah and the particularness of Jeremiah that makes him this prophet set out for this prophetic duty? And it's a particular situation, not a universal situation.
Well, can you
Go ahead.
Can you identify? I mean, a lot of times the prophets, they use a lot of metaphorical, poetic language. So what sort of genre is it here? Because if you juxtapose that against, like later we'll get to Exodus, which is they're trying to adjudicate a thing. So and this would be, I would borrow from Borg, is like in the New Testament, we took the Christian history and metaphorized it, which is okay. But the problem is when you metaphorize something and then you metaphorize your history, and then when you literalize the metaphor, you tend to get some foolish kind of things here. And I just wonder, is there enough here? Because generally in interpretation, if you get the genre wrong, you get the interpretation wrong. Quite often.
Sure. Well, I mean, Jeremiah is prophetic text, and the prophetic texts tend to have a flow to them for sure. It is pretty standard prophetic fare for the prophet to be set aside in some way, to be marked in that way, whether that is, Samuel or Jeremiah or Isaiah, somebody that is set aside in some purpose for this. You get the same kind of language in and around Jesus, right? Set aside in some way to be this prophetic person. So from that sense, it's just kind of par for the course. When you read the whole of that passage, it's very, very clear that Jeremiah, these words from God are meant for Jeremiah. And they're meant for that for a purpose, because Jeremiah has a very difficult task ahead of him and needs the sense of being called out in that way.
I have a new standard New Revised Bible, and in mine it says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations."
Right.
I think that's what you're saying here.
Right.
This was
Because
definitely.
when the line gets pulled out, it tends to be just the first part of the line, which is before. Yeah, they don't go to the I've called you out, I've consecrated you, I've named you as a prophet, because that gives us the impression that this is a specific thing, not a universal thing. Okay? Now we'll venture into the New Testament a little bit. We'll look at Luke in the first chapter, 41 through 44. And whenever somebody has it and wants to read, let me know.
When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. With a loud voice, she blurted out, "God has blessed you above all women, and he has blessed the child you carry. Why do I have this honor that the mother of my Lord shall come to me? As soon as I heard your greeting, the baby in my womb jumped for joy."
So now, why would you think that would be pulled out?
Well, because John was moving around and jumping inside her womb,
Right?
just like a baby would.
Mm-hmm. Implies consciousness from the baby, right? Awareness of what's going on. Like the baby could hear the Aramaic that they were speaking to each other, understood the Aramaic, and yeah, right. So you understand why that gets pulled out. It's a sign of consciousness from the fetus. Okay. We do not. Well, I mean, you can ferret some of that out because they give you kind of a timeline a little bit in other parts and in other gospels. But
Okay, now the maternal health expert gets to talk.
I was hoping you would do that.
Thank you. So back in this day, you can find in a lot of scripture a lot of like superstition, magic making kind of stuff that we would read it and go, "Oh, well, I wouldn't have assumed that," kind of thing. This is the same thing. The baby happened to move at the time that this happened, and she just made meaning to it. And that's what happened.
They didn't mention that Elizabeth had a burrito the night before. Yes. Now, here's the other thing it could be. I mean, that's really trying to make that a moment in history, so we're explaining scientifically like what happened in this moment in history. We could also look at this mythically, which is to say none of what is detailed in the first chapter of Luke may have actually historically happened. It's a story created for a purpose. It's meant to say, pay attention to these special figures. In some ways, the baby John, the fetus John, jumping in the womb is similar to Jeremiah's story in the sense that this is like, pay attention to this. Right? This is highlighting these are special people as part of the narrative of the story, not as a moral statement, not as a statement of scientific fact, not as a descriptor of how, or an answer to the question, when does life begin? That's not in the minds of the people writing this. Pausing.
I'm wondering if instead of using 41 through 44 for pre-birth rights, whatever, could we not use 34 and 35 and 36 to trust women?
We'll read what it says.
Because it says, "Then Mary said to the angel, 'How will this happen since I haven't had sexual relations with a man?'"
Right.
And they trust her, like they
Right.
listened to her. Like, why is that hard to do now? And then it goes on to say, the angel replied, "The Holy Spirit will come over you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the one who is to be born will be holy. He will be called God's Son." She goes on to say that to the people, and they trusted her.
Well,
Somewhat.
Yeah,
I mean,
that might be.
There was some controversy there, but
yes.
how much?
Joseph eventually trusts
Joseph
her,
did.
depending on which gospel you're reading.
Right. I'm wondering, though, if
he needs a visit from an angel to say, "Hey, Joseph, dude."
Right. But if we can cherry pick that to be pre-life,
Sure.
pre-birth,
Right.
why can't we cherry pick it to trust women?
Well, sure.
I like that better.
Right. I mean, both of them are abstractions, right? Both of them are abstractions. Right. If you're going to cherry pick for one, yes, you got to cherry pick for all of them, right? We all cherry pick, by the way, just so we're clear.
One of the things that comes out at me is about how some people use this to say our greatest blessing and our utmost responsibility as women is to have children. And so that's why our life may not be as important as that child we're carrying.
Correct.
Because that is the greatest responsibility that we have as women. So I've seen
Yeah.
it used in that way as well.
And that is 1,000% the culture from which this is written. In fact, it's not even responsibility. It's like your only function is to do this. Right. Yes, Kathy.
One thing I've always wondered, or for a while have wondered about this story, is that Mary is going away from where she lives to somewhere else while she's pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a practice in cultures, if the woman wants to keep the baby, to send her away. And so this is a way of framing that story in a way. But, you know, I'm sure Mary did not have a Dear Diary, nor did Elizabeth. So it has to be something that, you know, these women weren't blabby, you know, here's me. It's an unlikely story.
It is, and it's a story. I mean, we're drifting a little bit off here at this point, but I think it's a story that we need to, especially in Luke, and we need to think about the courage it took to even have a child. The mortality rates were very, very high, both for babies and for women, and it was literally risking your life to create life. And the chances were very high that you would have, minimally would have complications. Not to mention the fact that if you gave birth to a female, it didn't even really count. Yeah.
If I can put a tiny little maternal health expert footnote in here.
Yeah.
Dink. Just tiny, because I will try not to turn it into a TED Talk. It actually wasn't that risky to women because they had midwives that have known for a long, long time how to do stuff. It was more risky for children, yes.
Okay. Let's move on to Exodus 20:13.
Do not kill.
Hmm?
Do not kill.
That's Exodus 20:13, isn't it? Hard to cherry pick that one. Or what does the King James say? Thou shalt not kill. Yes. All right. It's part of the Ten Commandments. The question becomes a couple of different things from our moral perspective here in the 21st century. If we are going to take that seriously, and if we're going to say that applies to unborn fetuses, which is the argument from the pro-life side, how does that also not apply to people on death row, right? That seems a much easier argument to make. That'd be one contradiction that's problematic. How does that shape the policies that we make? Both in terms of there's somebody back there. Both in terms of how we deal with our resources, how we make sure that things are equitable, because lots of things kill. So how do we address all that?
I've spent my career in nursing, and I worked in nursing homes as well as hospitals. I've taken care of patients that were born with only a part of a brain. I mean, so, you know, and nowadays we can x-ray the child and, you know, before birth and see, you know, how well they're developing. Would that also go, I mean, would that give the parents or mother or whatever the grace or whatever you want to call it to say, let's terminate the pregnancy before the child's born? I mean, because if they're born without with just maybe the brainstem and nothing else, what kind of life is that? You know?
It becomes a very, very complicated issue. I also know, as all of you know, and I know he would not mind me using this as an example, if you think of Jessica Harper, you know, and Steve and his wife at the time in their decision, Steve and Bobby's decision, when they knew, you know, there were going to be complications, and they lived a long life with Jessica against heavy odds and with lots of support, and they made that choice. And the point would be, you know, that someone is able to make that choice and not have that. That's a lot. That's a lot. Raising a kid who is typically developing, etc., is a lot. Can I get an amen from Tabitha? Right. Yeah. I mean, so in the best of circumstances, it's a lot. And in the worst of circumstances, the question is, you know, what is the best decision? Well, that becomes really, really hard to answer, because the answer might be one thing at this point in time and a very different thing at a different point in time. And so you have to make the best decision you can make given the medical advice, etc. And whether something is morally correct or not, the idea that we are going to develop a purely moral system in which that's how we live is, listen folks, this is why we have grace. This is why God is a God of grace, is because there is no way for us to do those things, in part because we don't see the way God sees. And we can't know those things. So one of the questions, one of the approaches from one side of the movement would be say, yes, you don't know those things, so you just trust that God will handle this and take care of this, and you just go with it. And the other side of that may say, but you also don't know whether God is saying, stop. Like, choose a different, your path is not here, it's here. Right? And it's very hard to discern those things. And the point is, that's why we're having two different arguments. And we've had that this entire time. An argument over what is life, when does it begin, what is it, what's the sanctity of it, and the argument over how do we make tough moral decisions. And these are two different things.
So if we go further into Exodus, like the next chapter, you have chapter 21, verse 22 through 25. So it's where...
you mean?
In Exodus, yeah, that one. There you go. Okay.
Yeah. Don't get ahead of me, Tim. So let's everyone, in addition to Tim, turn to Exodus 21, 22 through 23. As we talk about sanctity of life, as we talk about the value of life, we often measure that in certain ways. And one of the ways that we do that from a policy point of view, in terms of just how we structure ourselves as a society, is to say that if you take somebody's life, that's a violation of the sanctity of life, and there's some form of punishment for that. Now, in some cases, it's an eye for an eye, a life for a life. In other cases, it's some other kind of punishment. But there's some acknowledgement that some debt has occurred because of the loss of this life. All right. So Exodus spells out, as well as Deuteronomy, as well as Leviticus, and not always in the same manner, spells out for the Hebrews what these structures are supposed to look like. So somebody read Exodus. Please have Tim read it, for crying out loud.
Let's see. That's 22. Okay. If men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are not to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
Does anybody have any other kind of translation? Yeah, right over here, New Revised. That's New International, I think.
Mine says, starting with verse 23, if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand
Yeah, I
for
think that's
hand.
what he said.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think he.
You shall not.
Yeah,
Okay, no.
I think he just.
Mine's the same then.
Yeah. Yeah. Yours says you shall give, right?
But if there's no serious injury, 23, you are to take life for life.
Right.
Eye for eye, right.
So what is not mentioned in that passage? What is there no punishment for?
Yeah.
There's no punishment for the child, for the fetus. It's the woman, right? If she's not hurt, everything's cool. Well, I mean, you have some restitution, some payment, or something like that, whatever the husband asks, right? If she is hurt, then it's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's the Deuteronomic or the law.
And I just got to point out there's no punishment for her.
No, yeah, that is correct. Well, she's the injured party in this,
Yeah.
potentially.
So I'm talking about miscarriage. So if
Oh,
somebody
yeah,
has
right,
miscarriage,
right,
they
right.
shouldn't be shuffled off to jail because they.
No. The punishment's not on her. The
Oh, I know, but
punishment
I'm
is-
just talking about. I'm making the current
yeah.
public
Right,
comment
sure.
on
Sure,
women
sure.
going to jail
Right.
because they miscarried.
Right. At no fault of their own, right? In this case, also no fault of their own. She's attacked in some way, miscarries. The point of all of this is to note there's no thought in the head of whoever is writing these laws to account. We're doing an accounting here. Let's count up the lives here and make it equal. And there's no accounting for the fetus. This is not really cherry picking in the same way. This is understanding like what's going on in the assessment of this, whether we agree with this or not, whether whatever. It's the idea that they are making a ruling in here about sanctity of life or about life, and they're not counting the fetus. Okay? So if we're going along this line, and we're thinking about what the Bible says, then we have some thinking to do. Now, the really clever people will look at this and note something. Well, I think you'll notice something about the picture itself. What does this say?
Stop executions.
Stop executions now. And his mask says abolish the death penalty. It's a twist. This is not a protest of abortion. This is a protest of the death penalty. Okay.
This just reminds me, there are some states that have laws on the books that if you kill a pregnant woman, you are also liable for the death of the fetus.
There's, yes, right, yes, right. Which we should note is not biblical.
Yeah, which
unless, how do you want to read it? I mean, the clearest passage we have that's not an abstraction says you shouldn't do that.
That results in
Right.
2 charges.
Right. So here, these are sanctity of life, additional sanctity of life passages that are drawn out. I recognize that we're getting close on our time, so I want to make sure. There's Jeremiah 1:5 again. Okay, so we've already covered that. There's Genesis 1:27. Anyone want to hazard a guess at that without even looking at it? Genesis 1, first chapter. Not very deep into that. Right. Right. Matthew 5. You want? Yeah. Take a look. Take a look at Matthew 5, 21 through 22. Yep. Go ahead. Oh, Corinthia has to read it.
Oh, you're not there. Never mind.
I don't know how to get there. Jesus. Sorry.
I thought you were handing it to her to read.
Me too, but she's in something else. I don't know what
See,
she's
that's
about.
how we use Apple products.
Anyone have Matthew 5, 21 through 22?
You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," you will be liable to the hell of fire.
Yeah. How about that? That's Jesus, ladies and gentlemen. And what's Jesus saying in that? It's not enough just to say, well, hey, at least I didn't kill him. That sanctity of life extends far beyond what it is that we are actually engaged in, and in fact might extend to saying threats, might extend to hateful language, might extend to being angry with someone. Even that. Ain't none of us innocent of that, right? Being angry with somebody. Okay. 1 Corinthians 3, 16 through 17.
Don't you know that you are God's temple and God's Spirit lives in you? If someone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, because God's temple is holy, which is what you are.
Right. Now that's it's even taking lines. I would say, when I've cautioned you to not to watch when people cherry pick and take a line out of context, I'm going to recommend that you be even more cautious of that when it's Paul from one of his letters, because he has very complex arguments. And you take one line out of that, and you're likely missing the point of all of that. So you would have to see, and Paul is immensely sarcastic. And yeah, so you get, which I love him, that's why I love him. You get this, you can read things and go, oh, does he mean this? But when you read it in context, you're like, he's being sarcastic. Like he's saying, oh, well, you guys say this and this and this, and you, sanctity of life. And so people read that, and they're not reading the rest of it, where he's like clearly mocking. And then they take it as this is what he means. Right. The point of all of this kind of study is to say that we are left to discernment. There are really very few things that the Bible is really, really clear about, and unequivocally clear. Those things are, we are to protect the vulnerable, we are to care for the wounded and the weak, we are to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit the prisoners. That's unequivocal in the Bible. You don't have another place in the Bible where it says, don't feed the hungry people. And isn't it interesting that in a predominantly Christian nation, we focus so little on the things that are unequivocal and focus so much on the things that are really, really completely. This would have been much more dramatic had that done. Really completely about discernment. And that skill of discernment. When the Bible isn't clear, what do we do?
So there's no passages for the pro-choice to pull out of the Bible and say, well, here.
Not really. I mean, there are verses about discernment. There are verses about following God and following the Spirit and doing those kinds of things. But I mean, it's not an issue in the Bible the way that it's an issue in our culture. So there's not commentary in the same way that there's commentary. We think that there are pro-life passages in the Bible that are anti-abortion because we've been told that that's what they are. But even a very cursory glance at them this morning proves to us that they are not, at least not in the way that we talk about these things. And the idea of sanctity of life is left up to us to decide, to discern about, in the same way that they are clearly discerning about these things. Even as they make laws in the ancient Hebrew world, they're clearly trying to think to themselves, what is life to life? What is equal life to equal life?
The Mishnah actually gets into that with the rabbis, where they very clearly see that the as we would call the fetus, is not co-equal to the mother. So right. they struggle with, they deal with that interpretation and they struggle. So I would think sometimes, like, if we're going to deal with Hebrew scriptures, check with some of the interpretation of the rabbis.
This is why Fred's comment was spot on, which is that we ought to be more Jewish with our approach to the Bible in general, which is that we argue about it, right? And we discern it and we wrestle with that. We don't, which necessarily means that we take the authority of the Bible and we move it down several pegs, right? So that it is on the same level as our prayer life, as our engagement with the Spirit, as our interaction as a community. It's part of our connection to the divine. It's a record of past wrestlings with all of this stuff. And some of the answers it gives us are terrible. And some of the answers it gives us are worth exploring.
See, I'm not a mother, never have been. What I do know is that a baby, as you know, in the mother's womb, it's not viable until it's at least 8 months old, or at least 7 or 8 months in pregnancy, because you don't have the heart. The heart's there, but the lungs aren't developed. It won't survive outside of the body until that point.
It's actually, science makes this a much more complicated argument for us in some ways. It also makes it an easier argument in some ways. And so we have another tool at our disposal that they did not have in the ancient world. Okay, you're wrapping us up. Oh, well, Kathy's wrapping us up.
Getting
it's
us
10
back
o'clock,
to,
just so you know.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do the summary. I'll do the abstract. Getting back to the history, abortion back in the 1800s was not even an issue when it first became illegal in the United States. Did not become an issue until those in power started to realize that white women with money were getting abortions. Then they threw a hissy fit.
Yeah. Hold on, Kathy's got the wrap up here.
Oh, sorry. Well, what didn't exist at the time the Bible was written or whatever was safe abortion and birth control.
Mm-hmm.
We have the ability to reduce drastically unwanted pregnancies just by educating and providing birth control.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great disservice to everybody in the world to ignore that.
Yeah, so my final wrap up for all of this is to say when we really talk about this issue, the underlying issues that we never really talk about are the assumptions about hierarchy in our culture, the role of women in our culture, the empowerment of women in our culture, the move from this sense that it's either your responsibility or maybe just your sole function, right, which is that biblical notion of things. And so it becomes about sexism in our culture at some level, and it becomes a conversation about how do we negotiate what has always been, both in the biblical world and in our own world, a patriarchal decision-making process. Next week, we'll have some of the same things because we will be talking about same-sex relationships in the Bible. Now notice I didn't say what does the Bible say about homosexuality. We're going to talk about that from a slightly different angle. For those of you who are familiar with the term, we'll look at what are called the clobber passages, which are the passages that are most commonly used from the Bible to bash on LGBTQ plus folks, and to note that this is very much in our framework right now. It's still out there, still exists. This church, your church, friends, has enabled and hired Jenny Wachowski-Estes to be our community chaplain. One of the things Jenny is doing is going out to rural pride events. Jenny was in Tishomingo yesterday for their first pride event ever, where the protesters sang, "Jesus hates you, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." So let us look at that next week, okay? We'll come back and look at that.